The first talk will be by PG Hagerty, and open source isn't what it used to be. So let's introduce PG on the stage.
Welcome to the stage, PJ.
Let's give him a...
Thank you for being here.
Let's give him a few seconds to connect, because he has this beautiful Apple with all those dongles connected, as we can see.
It's a look.
Oh,
Dongle world.
yeah.
Let's see. We do see
Okay,
a screen.
we see something. Yeah, that's...
Yay.
Great.
It
So,
worked, just
it's
like
all
this.
yours. It's all his, right?
Yeah, it's all yours.
Perfect.
All right.
Go for it.
Take
Thank you
care.
both.
Good
Thank
luck.
you both.
There you go, PJ Hagerty.
Hey, everybody.
Close.
My name is PJ Hagerty, and I'm going to talk a little bit about open source isn't what it used to be. This is going to be an interesting talk. I work at a place called devrelate.io. We do developer relations and community relations as a service. So, you're building a product, you've got an API, you've got an SDK, you've got things that you want developers to use. We help find your developer community and help you interact with them through content and conference talks, things like that. I'm happy to talk more about that, but that's not what the talk's about. I like to start things off by setting expectations. So today we're going to be taking a look at a little bit of the history of open source, like where did we come from, how did this all get started, why do we do what we do, sometimes good intentions, bad execution, where we've kind of fallen by the wayside and things didn't go well. Then we're going to jump into where things stand today. So things have changed a lot over the past 4 or 5 years, and we need to be aware of that. Then kind of how we do things ethically and make open source a better place, and then how to be a good open source citizen. So one of the things that I'm going to be really focusing on is evolution and adaptation. So usually I walk around a lot on stage. I'm not going to be doing that as much today. I'm going to try to limit it, because yesterday my wife and I, we arrived in Florence. We're like, Florence is beautiful, but we've got this one day. Let's take the speed train to Venice. So we took the speed train to Venice. And as I was walking out of the station, I saw this lady drop her suitcase, and I laughed at her. And this is where everything went wrong. I laughed at her. I took a picture of my wife. I took a step on a broken stone. I twisted my ankle. I learned about adaptation here. For example, Venice, being what it is, they had to adapt, and their ambulances are boats. So I went on a water ambulance boat. That was super cool. I learned about the Italian healthcare system and how they don't like people that don't speak English or don't speak Italian. I learned that everything was amazingly more efficient and cheaper than the United States, where I live. So it was all a big learning journey. It was very positive. But we're going to get more into that. Let's start with the history. So this is an image of a developer that I've been using in talks since I started speaking 14 years ago. And to say this is kind of like what an open source developer looks like, it's not too far off from when it first became a meme in the early 2000s, but it's kind of an understatement. In order to find our origins, we need to go back to the pre-internet days, prior to the growth of widespread computer use in the 70s and 80s. Back then, computer scientists and programmers, they often shared software. It wasn't considered a big deal because there was no consumer market. So if you built a piece of software, you weren't like, oh, we're going to get VC capital and make millions of dollars. You were like, well, I guess I'll share this with the folks at the other university or the other government entity. It's the Unix operating system. We're all using it. Why not try to help each other out? Once it became more common to commercialize the software, though, that concept of sharing started to go away. Capitalism. This is not going to be a big anti-capitalist rant. We can do that outside having cigarettes, whatever. But in the 80s and 90s, there were individuals and collectives that began to pop up, and they called themselves hackers. Now, this isn't what you see on LinkedIn today, when people are like, I'm a hacker, I've been hacking for several years. No, these are people that were nefarious actors specifically trying to find software vulnerabilities that they could take advantage of. They were bad people. Bad people. But now, people literally use that as a job description. So things change pretty quickly. Just as things were beginning to kick off, and Steve Jobs and the Woz were in a garage building the Apple II, and Bill Gates was still convincing people that Altair Basic Interpreter was the future. And I don't even know how many of you know what that is, but you can look it up. Something really strange started to happen in the background. So this guy wasn't an entrepreneur. He was just a generally good dude. His name's Donald Knuth, or Knuth, depending on how you pronounce it. And he published a thing called Text, which is a typesetting language for programmers. And he did it for free. And then he said, anyone can use this, anyone can edit it, anyone can do with it what they want. And people are like, what is this? They're like, we're calling it open source software. Anyone could use text any way that they wanted. This was in the summer of 1979. What a crazy time to be alive. But text was a drop in the bucket. But it's, in order to start the ocean, you had to first have a drop. But it happened slowly. A few years after Don released text, a group at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, yes, back in the 70s, they were talking about AI. This isn't a new thing. They built an alternate operating system, so you didn't have to use Unix, called GNU or GNU. I'm not going to get into that argument. The goal was honorable. Let's make a free operating system that anyone could use. Now, still, it's like 1980s. Like, not many people have a computer at home, so they're thinking about still the business market, people that have an alternative somewhere in the business market. Unlike Don's contribution, though, where he just said, hey, text is free to everybody, GNU came with an interesting announcement, a manifesto, stating the goal of software should be to leave it open for programmers to view and edit, to build better and modify for better public use. No one would profit from this, but profit wasn't really the point either. The development to this led to an interesting thing in the 90s. At this point, the languages being used in mainstream computer programming, and mind you, it still wasn't even common to have a home computer in the 80s and 90s. Languages were proprietary. A lot of times you had to get a bunch of disks from Microsoft and create Visual Studio and build C++, C. You had to do all these things on your own. Nothing was open source. You had to pay for it. But we began to see a change. So while Microsoft was laying the foundations for Visual Studio and languages like C++ and Visual Basic, Apple was building an empire of weird hardware that people found aesthetically pleasing if it didn't really do much. In the background, programmers began to want more. They decided that they wanted to have more investment in what was going on with their jobs and what they did for a living. So the arrival of Linux and other alternate OSs like Norton Commander in 1991 meant we were no longer tied to the operating system of the machine that we purchased. We could actually take a machine and remove Windows and put something else on it, and that machine was still functional, was still usable. I mentioned Norton Commander because that was one of the first operating systems that I ripped Windows out of a machine to put into. So that just shows you two things. One, there were options out there. Two, I'm old. But it's an interesting thing. These things are no longer proprietary. We're looking outside of that, and we didn't have to use what was being used in a corporate environment. Ruby was conceived of in 1993 as a language that made programmers happy. As the web became a major player in the game, we started to see PHP, which I know that you guys made a couple jokes about PHP in the beginning and WordPress, but PHP is still considered somewhere around 65 to 70% of the internet today. Even if you're running a Ruby on Rails application, there are PHP packages inside of it, believe it or not. I recently worked at Spotify. They only unloaded all of their PHP about 7 to 8 months ago. So that tells you PHP is still a major player. But back in the 90s, it was a new thing. Perl came out in 1997. Larry Wall was like, I want to build a language that builds the web. He built Perl. And it's weird to think that 3 of the most foundational open source languages, all 3 are still in heavy use today. And they started in the late 80s, early 90s trying to figure out how to do things better than the way Microsoft was doing things. And perhaps this lasting power is because open source projects tend to build communities around them. And we'll touch more on the community aspect later. All this was still relatively quiet in the background. Hackers and collectives of programmers would know about it. And it was even hinted at the ridiculous portrayals of programmers in the media with movies like Hackers and Sneakers and things like that where, even in Jurassic Park, it's like, oh, this is Unix, I know this. But then, one media company, a small publisher who wanted to make books for developers, they thought more people wanted to learn to code, let's make books. They published a book that made open source more of a household name. So Eric S. Raymond wrote a book detailing what open source really was called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, introducing the new concepts of open source to the world, along with an ethical note on how they should be handled. And the concept was super simple. There's 2 different free software development models. The Cathedral model, in which the source code is available with each software release, but code developed between releases is restricted to an exclusive group of software developers. So this is where like GNU, Emacs, and the GCC are presented as examples in his book. The Bazaar model, Bazaar, not bizarre, Bazaar, in which code is developed over the internet in the view of the public. So Raymond provides an example of this implementation. He was using the fetch mail project. So a lot of times email is proprietary or belonged to AOL or Prodigy or things like that if you wanted your personal email. Fetch mail was an open source email protocol where you could develop your own email system within a small system, within a LAN or a WAN or within a company. So that was pretty intense. So we kind of have these 2 models. We had to figure out exactly what we were doing. Seems like we're on the road to great things, right? And thus far, this leads us to about the early 2000s. everything is idyllic, everything's rosy, software, languages, operating systems, built for everyone. Naturally, this should level the playing field. No longer was development in computer science a rich person's game. You didn't need hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase equipment or build OSs or work with things. You could do this at home by yourself. There was no cloud back then, so you're still kind of doing it on disks or passing things through, the newly graced USB 1 keys that were around. But there was essentially no governing body. So no one was actually in charge of this. No one could stop you. Unfortunately, this was a non-hierarchical utopia that came with a few problems. We start with toxic actors, people who through various means like misogyny, poor social behavior, sexism, racism, and the belief that they're so much more intelligent than everyone else in the room, these people made the world of open source very closed and kind of unhappy. Even the leader of the EFF, the Electronic Freedom Foundation, is a person who has such reprehensible values that people are unwilling to be involved. In fairness, some of these people have learned from their actions, though really only one of the people pictured here, and I'm not going to name them, has done so, and then only kind of like a little bit. These people made it difficult to get into open source development while claiming to be working to welcome more people in, and more people into the community. But it seems like what they wanted was this concept of meritocracy, and they believed that the first merit that anyone could have is to look an awful lot like themselves, sharing the same, often narrow worldview. Luckily, we were able to counteract that a little bit because most of the world moved on from the concept of the benevolent dictator model. We don't need the direct creator of a library or package manager to be part of our community. We kind of have control of this. At the heart, we build software. Whether it's web applications, mobile operating system, DevOps scripts, whatever it is, we build in a community for a community and have the opportunity to participate as much as or as little as we want. When we participate, though, we need to do it in a way that keeps the gate open for those that come later. One of the things that I often say when I'm working with clients at DevRelate is like, yes, you have a great piece of technology and that's wonderful, but technology is built for people. Are you making people's lives better? Are you making some task easier? Is there something that you're doing that makes people's lives better? And I don't mean their work lives, I mean their actual lives. Like many things that are created by a community, though, there was still initially no way to govern the world of open source. Windows OS came with an end user's licensing agreement as long as my leg, which is currently non-functional. And Apple was so lawyered up that they actually sued Windows for the concept of a clickable user interface. That's real. There's a great movie about it based on a book called Pirates of Silicon Valley about the battle between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and who actually created the concept of the Windows operating system. Open source had none of that, though. In the beginning, we didn't really need it. There was no need to worry because it was really just the community using it, and like we were all cool with each other. That was fine. But as time wore on, as larger organizations and companies began using it, eventually government entities around the world, who owned and who was responsible for something became very important. Now, luckily, as many people wanted to use and ensure open source stayed safe, the world of licensing grew. And licensing, I'm not, just in case you didn't pick this up yet, I'm not Johnny follow the rules, but licensing was a wonderful thing in the fact that large-scale organizations like Red Hat and Apache saw the potential of what could go on, but they wanted safety rails. They wanted things built. So they needed that legal entity to put together. So these organizations did what they thought was right. They open sourced the licenses so that the community could build the license that they wanted. Projects, organizations could be safe. So right now there's like well over 100 different licenses available. It's easy to find a way to safely open source software solutions in the modern context. That said, that it's also meant that money came into things like open source. And that brings us to the modern era, which is how to create and consume open source in an ethical way. But first, let's actually look at where we are today. So things have really branched out in forms of open source operating systems. It's not just MIT's GNU experiment. There's so many things that are more specialized. Linux is now a default on most cloud servers. Like you're gonna find some form of it, usually Ubuntu, but there's lots of different server protocols, lots of different operating systems you can use just for servers, not even for your main, day-to-day stuff. There's GUI desktops in Linux that are super more common than ever before. Will it ever be the #1 desktop solution in the world? Probably not. I don't think there's ever gonna be a #1 ever again, but I think things are balancing more than they used to. You can now do things that are linked. You don't have to, battle it out and say, oh, I'm going to play a video game, so I have to boot into Windows. You can actually do that through Linux now. You can do that through lots of different operating systems. It's not necessary to have these weird things. It's, 20 years ago, it was kind of busted. It was like buying cereal, and in the US we have Kellogg's and General Mills, but you could also buy like the store brand cereal, which is good, but not quite as good. But it's not like that anymore. It isn't just It isn't just, oh, I'll get good enough and Linux will be good enough for what I need. These are actually powerful, well thought out operating systems that function. But it isn't just the operating systems or the servers. Software is super open source as well. There are so many languages in use today. I mentioned Ruby, Perl, and PHP before. From there, they inspired a lot of the languages that we use more commonly, and we've seen continual growth in both functional and object-oriented programming languages. So things like Elixir, Haskell, Scala, Erlang, Go, Rust, Python, TypeScript, R, Kotlin, along with Ruby, Perl, and PHP, are basically how people are doing things. And I didn't even mention JavaScript. There's a whole world of JavaScript that's all open source. I have feelings about that. We can discuss that offline. But these are the most popular programming languages. People aren't saying, I need to use C# because Microsoft is the biggest game in town. That's not necessary. If I have a startup, I can easily build a Rails app just for my proof of concept and then build out some Python on the back end, JavaScript on the front end, and have a beautiful thing. That's actually how Twitter got started. Like, okay, I mean, it is what it is, but put politics aside. It was a simple app that was built in a simple way that works very functionally and is large scale. You don't need to have major proprietary stuff. And then there's the fact that all these modern languages and companies have flourished to build an ecosystem of companies that build sturdy things on. And I'm speaking here mostly about startups. Startups love open source because, you get something for free, but also it's easy to build that prototype, that MVP, without paying for an IDE and making sure everybody has the old Visual Studio stuff. Anyone with any machine can start building. You can sit there and say, oh, you know what, I have an idea. Give me 20 minutes to code a little bit of this out, and let me see if I can actually prove that it's a functional thing. And you can do that without spending any money, assuming you already have a computer, which you do. There's probably one in your pocket. And it grew from there. The big companies started to take notice. Giant corporations, some of the largest in existence, are suddenly the home to open source. I know that when Microsoft bought GitHub and then became the largest open source contributor in the world, I was friggin' shocked. Google less so. But even Santander, the third largest bank in the world, is huge open source. They have giant open APIs that you can use to use their system. It's wild. But it didn't stop there. The shock didn't stop there for me. As I was researching this talk, I was like, that's crazy. Okay, so great, open source. The government agencies all around the world. This seems crazy, right? Governments are using open source software as we speak to build open source opportunities. In many cases, this is kind of the wild part of government agency. They are contributing back. Many government agencies are building what they want to see in the world, and open source gives them that opportunity. And we'll pause here for a second, because while it's exciting to give some of these folks, the spotlight, there's also some ethical issues there. Like it's always cool to be like, NASA and the European Space Agency use open source. Cool, Sweden uses it. We all like Sweden, like they make meatballs. They're super awesome. The Department of Defense of the United States of America, less cool. But still, a community has all parts. We have to welcome everyone, and they are actually participating in an ethical way. So let's talk a little bit about the ethics. It's important to have a definition, so I have a definition of ethics here. But the thing is, we want to understand how we best conduct ourselves, our business, and our participation in open source in a correct and moral way. Often our culture invades that sense of morality, so it can be different from region to region or culture to culture. But, we want to keep things open. We don't want to obfuscate what the true reflection of the community is or confirm our bias. So how can we avoid some of the potholes and participate in open source ethically? First of all, we have the definition. So we can start to see how that works. But there's still many hackers out there, both on the good side and the bad side, looking to exploit open source software. It's what they do once they find it out that is important, whether you're leveraging open source in an ethical way. So when I say leveraging open source now, you find a vulnerability. You can exploit that and take advantage of it, or you could report it to the organization that vulnerability is affected by and say, hey, listen, I'm just trying to help here. We all want a better community. That's the ethical way to do it. So having that kind of code of ethics and saying, I might have an opportunity to make a lot of money and do nefarious things, but I'm not going to do that. Cool. That's step one. Step two is considering the actual open source things. How do we ensure that we have a code of conduct while we're participating in a project? How many of you know if you have an open source piece of your project that you're working on or at work in your day-to-day, how many of you know about the contributor covenant? So the contributor covenant is an important thing for open source. It says that we're going to do this ethically, we're going to be open, we're going to be transparent, we're going to let as many people as part of that. And this is how viability comes in. Sometimes, not every company is ready to say that they're ready to jump in and participate in open source. They have to take baby steps, like starting maybe internal projects with no bearing on the product, or sponsorship of a meetup, or some sort of like community around the open source project. So you find out what level is viable before you jump into an open source project as an organization. There's also a thing like longevity. So one of the things that you need to look at when you're talking about leveraging open source is how long has this project been around? How long is it going to be supportive? You can't just think, does this solve our problem right now? You also need to be aware of whether you can actually sustainably participate in the community surrounding this project. It could be that the community is toxic. It could be that the community just has some bad members. It could be that they just don't have a lot of support, but that piece really helps you out. Are you willing to jump in and step in and say, we're going to take this over if somebody can't? There are questions here about longevity, and we need to be able to answer these in order to decide whether we can ethically leverage an open source project. This is one of the easy ways to find out about longevity is to consider the level of activity. So how many people are contributing to this? Is there just one person who created it and they're the only person working on it? Are there lots of people? How many GitHub stars does it have? That's kind of not always the best indicator. But the other level of activity is the level of participation your company or organization has in the project and the community around it. Do you plan to contribute code back to it? Do you plan to donate cash to the people who are building it? Or maybe help out with events like this one and give space for meetups. Like these are all things that lead to leveraging open source in an ethical way, to be a good open source citizen. So one of the biggest things about consuming open source ethically is giving back. Many of the companies that I mentioned earlier, both the big corporations and the tiny startups, are giving back with code. Giving back, though, can take a lot of different forms. It's simply improving the ecosystem to make life better for that open source project. It can be leading to a better community, a better experience, and of course there's nothing wrong with just giving people money. I hate to say that, but we live in a world. The world has a system. We have to operate within that system. I used to work at a company called Engine Yard back in the day. We were a platform as a service to help you launch into AWS, because back then launching into AWS was super hard, like it's so easy now. But we would help you get there. We were a major Ruby and PHP shop, and we would majorly fund Bundler and Composer because those are two things that all Ruby and PHP developers need to successfully do. Eventually, we started helping to fund NPM as well, because to build the ecosystem and make it better, makes it better for us, makes it easier for us to do our jobs. And while you get all those things started and you try to continue to focus on being a good citizen, you should never expect a developer who's worked a 40-hour work week working on the project to then spend 10 or 20 hours coding for the open source project. Forcing people into participating will never create a good environment. It's a setup for failure and a guaranteed road to burnout for developers. Also, when you build a team of developers, don't try to convert someone to becoming an open source contributor or even an open source evangelist. Some people prefer to focus on coding as a job, and that's okay. Some people just want to use this to pay the bills, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with focusing on development or computer programming as a 9-to-5 job. And I know that there's different attitudes towards the work and what's required to make a better product, but you can't force someone into being part of a community. And open source at its heart, yes, it's code, but it is a community. One of the best ways is, of course, to donate. There's lots of ways to do that. Tidelift, the open source initiative. I know it's a little hard to see, but there's nothing wrong with that, saying like, oh, you know what, I've got $10 this month. I'll toss it towards a developer or a project that really deserves it. But that comes with the other side of it. Open source projects are often maintained by individuals or small groups of people. Even larger projects often have a small governing board. You using an open source project and paying money to it or incorporating into your major product does not entitle you to special access to these maintainers, especially if you're not providing them with a full-time paycheck. So even if members of your team are core contributors, your organization is in no way entitled to getting features or fixes simply because you have a different status. The project is for the people, not just your people, but anyone currently using it, has used it in the past, or might use it in the future. It's not yours, it's all of ours. Of course, the best way to participate in open source is to open source everything you can. Absolutely 100%. Perhaps your auth system is new and novel in a way, but you don't work at an auth company. Open source it. Maybe you have a cool database connector. There's a chance you build something that's not crucial, that's not like your business critical differentiator, the thing that makes your business different from everybody else. If you have built something cool that is not your core business, open source it. A while back, I worked at a company that wasn't sure if their product was something that the market wanted. So the founder, in a conversation with a successful open source project maintainer, was told, open source the whole thing. And he was like, what? Don't we have to make money? Yeah, no, open source the whole thing. So this will tell you how viable it is. Do people want it? You open source it, you'll find out. So you can worry about monetization later. That company was called Mattermost. Mattermost is an open source version of Slack. You can put it just about anywhere. Hugely successful situation. And they monetize by saying, okay, well, you don't want to do it yourself? We'll put it in cloud. You can just pay for it by month. Everything can be open source. That company open sources their HR manual in case you want to make some changes or translate it or whatever. That's the kind of dedication to building the better community that people need from the companies and the organizations that want to build it better. It's a matter of knowing when to do it and who it's for. Find that audience and connect with them. So, as with everything, there is some things that change and evolve. Currently, there's a big move towards all things AI, and many of the AI platforms call themselves open source. What they mean is that anyone can use their platform without payment. This doesn't actually mean it's open source. This is a big argument I got in LinkedIn a few weeks ago. What they don't mean is that you can edit or code against the weighted language models. The language models are actually usually not open source. You can build your own language model and use their AI interface. You can use their language model, but you can't change it. You can't mess around with it. So it's open source, but it's not open source. And this is the nature of the changing definition of how the world sees things. Open source in some ways has become like kind of a marketing term. It brings people to the project, but then you realize at some point it's not as open source as you thought it was. This is a key on how we stretch definitions, how they change. Like when Web3 just started to define open source on a transactional basis. That was a terrible idea. Web3 is a terrible idea. We need to broaden our understanding. We need to understand what the community needs and how better to serve it in a positive way. And we need to be aware of the scams and the potholes and the steps you might miss and fall down and break your leg. But, so we see kind of where we started with our humble beginnings, going nearly all the way back to the beginning of computer science as a mainstream way of life. We went through the 70s and 80s and 90s, building on shoulders of people like Don Knuth, so that we could make a better world for modern engineers. We made some major slip-ups along the way. Sometimes we forget that the big idea is to make the entire world a better place, not just our corner of it, or just the people who look just like us. We know now that we're on stable ground. We can build the things for everyone, and we can even share a bit of knowledge and code that we have at every opportunity. I hope everyone sees this isn't some anti-capitalist, free will, let the code flow, hippie developer rant. This is a way of looking at open source differently in a modern context, differently than those who came before us, and probably in some cases, those who put a bad name on it, and it's gonna be different from the way that people look on it moving forward. So here's the part where I'm supposed to say something like really inspirational, you know, like last few slides, make it all seem like this wonderful idea I had one time, but I won't. My job here was to lay out the facts. I gave you the information. The inspiration's in your head, it's in your hands. To use a sports metaphor, the ball is in your court. Do with it what you must. But as you start to make that decision on what to do with that metaphorical ball in that imaginary court, know that you're armed with the knowledge of what open source is, what it can do for you, and how you can use it to make a better world. Thank you very much.
First of all, it was truly amazing, really. And the haiku at the end just nailed it. Before I'll ask if someone has questions, I have one question for you first. Why did you even start with open source? What was the trigger for you?
I mean, it's interesting. I came to open source non-voluntarily. So I was working in a company where we were using Visual Fox Pro. Anybody? No? Okay. Terrible language by Microsoft, and they end-of-lifed it. They said, we're not going to improve on this anymore. No one friggin' uses it. Why would we bother? So my head of development said, he's like, oh my God, what function? I've never done anything else. What functions like the way Visual Fox Pro does? So he's like, oh, so Postgres does querying in a similar way, so we'll move to Postgres. Well, what works well with Postgres? Ruby on Rails. And he came to me and said, can you learn Ruby on Rails in a week? And I said, hell no. It's like, we got hockey and dance tomorrow. Like, I don't have time for this. But we did eventually, we moved to Ruby on Rails with a JavaScript front end, and I just fell in love with the community. Like, it was just such a brilliant community. And that's what made the difference for me is when I would go to Windows conferences, it was very like, you know, button-down shirts and khaki pants, and everyone looks exactly the same, and no computers. Everyone would just bring legal pads and take notes. And I went to my first Ruby conference, like t-shirts and jeans. People are smoking outside. It's like beers at 2 o'clock. I'm like, these are my people. This is what I've been looking for.
Okay, so I totally agree with you, and I see we have a matching style.
Yeah, we've got to have mad riz,
Yeah.
as the kids say.
Okay, so are there any questions? Because I'm sure. No, nothing. Don't be
Not
shy.
enough coffee yet.
Don't be shy.
I do have a question for you. So you mentioned some big players. I'm not going to make name right now with the question, at least.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that those big players often participate in open source, which is true. We have proof of that, many. But I'm wondering, we are possibly aware of some of these big players making use of open source as a mean of financial returns. Let's put it like
Yes.
that, right?
Yes.
So how do you feel about that as an open source contributor and champion?
I consider it unethical. I think that especially if you're a big player and you're making massive dollars, like there's no reason why, at the very least, you can't give money back to an open source project. Like you're so profitable, and this goes into a whole like the way C-levels are working at companies these days, and the money grab that's going on in venture capital and how that works and all that jazz. And I don't want to get too far into that, but I think that if you are making money, if you are successfully profitable using open source technology, you need to be giving back either financially or with your time or your space. It's just that simple. And if you're not, you are an unethical open source participant.
Thank you very much for the answer. So a round of applause for our friends PJ Hagerty. Thank you.
Thank you so
Don't get
much.
off stage just yet.